The most consequential trade relationship in the world is breaking apart. Not slowly, not quietly, but in full view of history. The partnership that moved $1.3 trillion across a border every single year, the alliance that survived 2 world wars, the Cold War, and every geopolitical storm of the past century, is fracturing. And the man who broke it did not do so in a faraway land. He did it from a dinner table in Florida, with a joke that turned out not to be a joke at all. But here is the thing that nobody is asking loudly enough. How did the world's most successful bilateral friendship reach this point? And more importantly, is what we are watching now truly the end of something or the beginning of something far more dangerous? To understand what has happened between Canada and the United States over the past 12 months, you have to go back much further than most people are willing to look. You have to understand what was built before you can properly measure what has been lost. The story begins not in Washington or Ottawa, but in a shared recognition that 2 nations sharing the world's longest undefended border had everything to gain from growing closer together and very little to gain from standing apart. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney signed the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement. It was a landmark moment. Reagan himself called the 2 nations' friendship the envy of the world. Over the following decades, that agreement expanded into NAFTA in 1994 and was eventually modernized into the USMCA in 2020. 3 separate agreements across 3 decades, each one deepening the integration, each one building on the assumption that these 2 neighbors were not merely trading partners, but strategic allies whose prosperity was inseparable. By 2024, the annual trade between the 2 countries had reached $1.3 trillion. Canada was sending roughly 73% of all its exports south across the border. The United States was Canada's largest source of foreign investment, and Canada was the top destination for American goods exports. More significantly, Canada had become the largest supplier of American energy imports, accounting for 63% of all crude oil entering the United States by quantity. This was not trade in the abstract. It was the circulatory system of 2 economies that had been deliberately engineered to function as one. And then came November 2024. What happened at Mar-a-Lago on November 29, 2024 looks, in retrospect, like the precise moment the relationship changed. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made the trip to Donald Trump's Florida residence just weeks after Trump had threatened sweeping 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports. Trudeau went hoping to demonstrate the value of the relationship, to appeal to a shared history, to remind an incoming president what was at stake. What he got instead was a dinner where Trump suggested, to the nervous laughter of the assembled Canadians, that perhaps Canada should simply become the 51st state of the United States. Canadian officials initially described the remark as a joke. Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc, who was present that evening, called it one of the entertaining and funny moments of the night and said it was clearly not a serious comment. But within weeks, Trump had doubled down. He posted about it on social media. He threatened economic force to compel annexation. He began referring to Trudeau publicly as the governor of the great state of Canada. And when pressed, he refused to rule it out. The joke had become policy, and the policy had become a crisis. Trudeau himself would later tell business leaders that Trump's annexation talk was a real thing, motivated by his desire to access Canada's critical mineral resources. There was nothing funny about it anymore. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the crisis that Trump ignited in Canada did not weaken the country politically. It galvanized it. By January 6, 2025, Trudeau had resigned as Prime Minister, his personal approval ratings having collapsed long before Trump entered the picture. The Liberal Party chose Mark Carney as its new leader on March 9, 2025. Carney was a former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, the only person ever to hold both positions simultaneously, a man whose understanding of global finance was not theoretical but visceral. He had managed currencies during crises. He had spoken before parliaments and central banks and finance ministries across the world. And now he stood before a country in the middle of what he himself called the greatest crisis of our lifetimes. Carney called a federal election for April 28, 2025. He ran on a single central platform. Canada would defend its sovereignty. It would stand up. And the Canadian public, which had been watching Trump's tariff threats and annexation talk with a mixture of disbelief and fury, responded. The Conservative Party had held a 20-point polling advantage over the Liberals as recently as December 2024. By Election Day, that lead had evaporated. Carney won. And he won on a mandate to do something that no Canadian Prime Minister had done in the modern era: explicitly prepare Canada for a future in which the United States could no longer be trusted as a reliable partner. But winning an election and actually transforming a 75-year economic relationship are two entirely different challenges. And here is where the story of the past 12 months becomes both impressive and sobering in equal measure. Carney moved quickly after taking office. He committed unconditionally to meeting NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target, a target Canada had avoided for years. He tightened border security measures. He suspended implementation of a digital services tax that had been a major irritant in Washington. He made 2 separate visits to the White House and managed, at least initially, to establish a more functional tone than his predecessor had. Trump described Carney as a very talented person and said they had a very friendly conversation. For a brief period in mid-2025, there appeared to be a genuine framework for a trade deal taking shape. Talks were progressing. A 30-day deadline for agreement was announced at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta in June. But every deadline came and went without resolution. And then came October. In what may be remembered as one of the most consequential missteps of the entire episode, Ontario Premier Doug Ford commissioned a $75 million advertising campaign featuring archival footage of Ronald Reagan criticizing protectionism. The ads ran on American television during the World Series. Trump was furious. He saw it as interference in American domestic affairs. He shut down trade talks entirely and threatened an additional 10% tariff. Carney, speaking at an international summit in Asia, acknowledged he had seen the ad in advance and apologized to Trump directly. By October 2025, trade talks were dead. And so Carney pivoted. On January 16, 2026, he traveled to Beijing for the first Canadian prime ministerial visit to China in 8 years. The diplomatic freeze between the two nations had begun in 2018, when Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou on an extradition request from the United States. China had retaliated by detaining 2 Canadian citizens in what became known internationally as the Two Michaels case. Relations had remained frozen for years. Now Carney was sitting across from Chinese President Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People, negotiating a comprehensive trade agreement. The deal he secured was significant. Canada agreed to lower its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6%, allowing 49,000 vehicles per year to enter the Canadian market at that rate. In exchange, China committed to cutting its tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 84% down to approximately 15% by March 2026. For the 40,000 Canadian canola farmers who had been locked out of the Chinese market almost entirely, the deal represented a lifeline. Edward Alden at the Council on Foreign Relations called it a huge declaration of realignment in Canada's economic relations. It was also unmistakably a signal to Washington that Canada had options, and that the old assumption, Canada would always prioritize the American relationship above all others, could no longer be taken for granted. Trump's public reaction was surprisingly measured. When asked, he told reporters, "If you can get a deal with China, you should do that." But his administration was less sanguine. The U.S. Trade Representative warned Canada would regret the decision. The Transportation Secretary called it a mistake. The message from Washington was clear, even if Trump himself was not delivering it directly. Then came Davos. On January 20th, 2026, Carney took the stage at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, and delivered what many international observers called the most consequential speech by a Western leader in years. He told the assembled audience of presidents, prime ministers, and finance ministers that the rules-based international order was not declining. It was over. He used a single word to describe what was happening: rupture. Not transition, not adjustment, rupture. A tearing of the fabric that had held the global system together for 75 years. He spoke directly to what he called middle powers, nations like Canada, France, Germany, and Australia, countries with significant capacity, but not enough to stand alone against the true giants. And he delivered a line that cut through the diplomatic language of the room with unusual precision. If you are not at the table, you are on the menu. He laid out what Canada had been doing since he took office: doubling defense spending, signing 12 new trade and security agreements on 4 continents in 6 months, drawing closer to the European Union. He called it strategic autonomy, the capacity to say no. He stood at that podium and told the world, without once mentioning Trump's name, that the old framework was gone and that the only path forward was for like-minded nations to build something new together. International reaction was immediate and largely positive. The BBC called it one of the best speeches by a world leader in years. Less than 24 hours later, Trump took the same stage at Davos and lashed out at Carney directly by name, warning that Canada's existence was dependent on the United States and that the Prime Minister should show more gratitude. The contrast between the two appearances was striking. One had offered a vision of the future. The other had revealed something rawer and less considered. Where does this leave the relationship today? The honest answer is that nobody fully knows, and anyone who tells you otherwise is speculating beyond what the evidence supports. What is verifiable is this. As recently as April 19, 2026, just one day before this script was recorded, Carney released a public video address in which he told Canadians plainly that their country's economic ties to the United States, once a source of strength, had become a source of vulnerability. He said the United States had fundamentally changed its approach to trade, raising tariffs to levels not seen since the Great Depression. He said Canada had been a great neighbor, standing with America in Afghanistan and 2 world wars. And then he said something that would have been unthinkable from a Canadian Prime Minister even 2 years ago. The United States has changed, and we must respond. It is about taking back control of our security, our borders, and our future. We cannot rely on one foreign partner. The USMCA review is scheduled for July 2026. It is the next major test of whether this relationship can be stabilized or whether the fracture becomes permanent. The outcome is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the meaning of the past 12 months, a $1.3 trillion partnership built over 35 years of careful integration, tested and survived through wars and recessions and political upheaval, has been fundamentally shaken by something it had never encountered before. Not external pressure, not a global crisis, but a deliberate, sustained challenge from within the relationship itself. Carney did not choose this rupture, but he has chosen how to respond to it. And in doing so, he has changed what Canada's relationship with the world will look like for a generation. The question that remains open, and it is the question that will define the years ahead, is whether what has been broken can be repaired, or whether the partnership that Ronald Reagan once called the envy of the world has quietly, irreversibly, become something else entirely.